Ukraine is reeling from what could be the worst series of attacks on its power system since the war began. On Saturday, Russia sent a barrage of drones and missiles at power facilities across the country. The end result was more than 1.5 million homes and businesses left in the dark, about a third of the country. And the state power company says more rolling blackouts will be needed just as the country heads into its harsh winter. Well, Nick Robertson joins us now from Kyiv. And Nick, tell us about these latest strikes and how the power outages are affecting Ukrainians and the war effort.
Well, Ukrainian officials are assessing that the Russian military is working with Russian power engineers because they are systematically and very strategically targeting the weaker points within the energy infrastructure, rather than sort of trying to blow up the big power generators that are inside the buildings. You know, bricks and concrete protect those big pieces of equipment, which of course Russia would like to destroy as part of this campaign to reduce and turn off the lights here in Ukraine. What they're doing is hitting the transformers, the high voltage to low voltage transformers, the switching gear, the equipment that's at the output of the power plant. So those cables and big boxes that you see on the outside of electricity power generating plants, that's what's being targeted. And of course, the battle here for Ukraine is reduce electricity usage while it tries to repair them. And these big items are not that easy to repair if they're heavily damaged or even replaced. So that's the challenge at the moment. But President Zelensky is now appealing to everyone in the country, asking them to do their bit to save electricity, not use high power equipment if they don't have to, turn off lights. This is how he's framing it.
The main target for Russian terrorists is energy. Therefore, please consume electricity even more consciously than before. The stability of our state energy industry depends on each city and district of Ukraine.
So the bigger cities like Kyiv, like Lviv in the west, like Odessa in the south, have better air defense systems, it seems, because they're able to shoot down almost all the incoming missiles. But other areas seem to be the weaker spots within the air defense network, and that's what Russia's been targeting. 5 towns in the west of the country, one of those, Rivne, just to give you an example about how the electricity is affecting people there. It's the electricity supplying the power, supplying the air defense warning system. That's not working, so police have to drive around with loudspeakers when there are air raids on. The hospital doesn't have water, so they need to bus water to the hospital. In another area in the center of Ukraine, the electricity has been taken out that feeds the coal mine. The coal mine can't produce coal. The electricity power generating network here is hungry for coal, needs that coal. So this is why Ukrainian officials feel that Russia's being very strategic, hitting the bits of the network that will have the maximum impact and in the case of the coal mines, take down or further reduce more of the power grid.
Nick Robertson, we'll have to leave it there. We appreciate the update. Thanks for joining us from Kyiv. Well, for a closer look at the military situation in Ukraine, we're now joined by Mick Ryan, a retired Major General of the Australian Army. Mick, great to have you with us. I want to start by asking for your assessment of this war 8 months in.
Well, hello. It's good to be with you again. Well, what we're seeing at the moment, particularly from this new Russian Commander, General Surovikin, is a campaign against the Ukrainian people, because he can't lay a hand on the Ukrainian army on the battlefield. The Russian army has lost all momentum in every area of Ukraine. And in many respects, these missile attacks are about the only thing he can do against the Ukrainians at the moment while he builds strength through the mobilisation program.
But he's certainly being very effective by taking out the power grid or certainly certain energy infrastructure. That has a psychological effect as well as, you know, obviously a physical effect on the ground in Ukraine.
It certainly does. It has a psychological impact, and it's going to cause a humanitarian tragedy potentially over winter in Ukraine. I think importantly, it also has an economic impact because the Russians are trying to strangle the Ukrainian economy. And if they don't have power, businesses can't operate, and it'll reduce the economic output of Ukraine.
Mick, the southern city of Kherson, taken by the Russians early on in the war, looks to be preparing for battle. The pro-Moscow regional administration is calling on civilians to evacuate, while Russian forces are also withdrawing across the Dnipro River. Are Ukrainians on the brink of another breakthrough, or do you believe that this is a tactical retreat from the Russians?
Well, the new Russian commander certainly has to cede some ground. He can't defend all the territory that he already has. The west bank of the Dnipro River is very vulnerable. The Ukrainians have cleverly cut off most of the logistic resupply in there, and over the winter their problems will only get worse. I'd expect we're highly likely to see a withdrawal of most Russian forces west of the Dnipro in the coming weeks, although whether they'll hold on to Kherson City or not is another issue. That would be a political problem for Putin, particularly given he's just annexed that province.
The Russians say they have erected large-scale defensive fortifications in this area. I guess, what's your take on that statement, and how effective will it be?
Well, there's two ways we might read this one. The Russians might want to defend Kherson City, but if they do decide to stay and fight, they won't be leaving. I mean, the Ukrainians will root them out and destroy them in detail if they do decide to stay. What's possible is that this is a deception measure to get as many of their soldiers back across the Dnipro to the eastern side to preserve their army for the fighting next year. But we'll wait and see. Surovikin is whilst he is a brutal commander, he's a canny commander, and he probably has a couple of tricks up his sleeves yet.
Such as what? Can you elaborate?
Well, he'll certainly be trying to hurt the Ukrainians between now and the campaigning season next year. He'll be strengthening his logistics. He'll probably be trying to use these missile attacks against the power stations to get the Ukrainians to redeploy air defence from the front line back to these power stations, which will then allow him to use his air force more freely against the Ukrainians in the front line. So, he's only just started his command. I think we'll see a different style of command from this commander over the next few months.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about how he is targeting this energy infrastructure. Obviously, we're coming into these cooler months. It's going to be winter very soon, and it will be a very harsh winter in Ukraine. Do you expect him to continue targeting energy infrastructure? And how will this affect Ukraine's war effort and morale within the country?
There's no reason to expect he'll stop doing something that he thinks he's been successful at. I guarantee that this is getting plaudits for him back in Moscow from hardliners and from Putin. Putin can finally be seen to be doing something in Ukraine that, at least from a Russian perspective, appears to be working. But the reality is these kind of aerial bombing campaigns have not been successful historically. And what it also appears to be doing is strengthening European resolve to support Ukraine, which is the very opposite of what Putin wanted for this energy warfare that he's perpetrating against the Ukrainians.
Mick, do you envisage sustained fighting throughout the winter?
I think this is a war that will continue on through the winter. We may see a lower tempo, but the Ukrainians have a sniff of victory in places like Ukraine, in Kherson and in northern Luhansk. I don't see any reason why they will want to slow down. They may not be able to go as fast as they'd like in the winter months, but I believe they'll continue fighting, particularly as the Russians are exhausted. They'll be changing out experienced troops for less experienced mobilised troops. They will see opportunities over the coming months that they will want to exploit. They won't want to wait for the spring.